All right. So what I've done on Canvas. So we've got this week's modules, right? So we'll finish off last week. We didn't quite cover subsidies, so we'll start with that today. We'll then jump into module 7 slides, module 7 material, of which case you already have the practice problems and answers up there. I also mentioned, so I know these are supposed to be out of 4 points. I'll get those scaled tomorrow, so that just basically adds a point to everyone's score who did them, kind of scale them up to 4, okay? From here on out, I'll make sure that I've got the point total set to be a total of 4. So on this next one today, when we go through the questions at the end of class today, there'll be 3 questions. 2 of them you'll have set. I'm going to just give you participation of 1 point just for getting on and getting it done, and then half point for correctness for each question. All right, so a total of kind of 4 points there. 2 participation from the first, half point from the third question, half point for correctness from all 3. Will give us that total of 4, and that's kind of how we'll run things moving forward. Okay. But I'll get those kind of scaled up to 4. You'll see that happen tomorrow afternoon. I also uploaded, if I can get it here, there we go, kind of your CL attendance. So this is going to be only the recorded attendance prior to the exam. So it will not include this past week, right? So if you went last Sunday or you went, Thursday, 4 or 5 days ago, that's not showing up yet. So what I'll do is I'll kind of upload these right after exam 1. I'll upload them again. So you can see your attendance, what your attendance was, up to exam 2. And then we're going to have the 4 remaining weeks up to the final. I can get those uploaded that week before finals week, so you can kind of see what your total attendance is there, right? If you have any questions over your attendance in those first 4 weeks, feel free to reach out. But it is those first 4 weeks that were prior to the first exam. Now I have it scored as 1 point. It's not factoring into your grade here. If we go back to the syllabus, I've got some questions about this, but how much is each CL attendance every week is worth what extra credit? 0.25%, right? So here, this is kind of like your total percent that you've earned. You've attended the first 4, you earn a total of 1% added to your grade at the end of the semester. So it's not getting added in yet, it gets added in at the end of the semester. You continue to attend all of them. Eventually, the total points possible here would be, we've got 12 CL sessions, the total points possible would be 3. You go from an 87 to a 90, right? Or whatever the numbers end up being, okay? Any questions for me before we kind of start with material here? So on that quiz 5, I apologize, by the way. I think this was the section that was impacted. If it wasn't, it was my other one. But when I copy these over, because I'm using Canvas's, you don't care about this, but I'm using their new quizzes feature, there's a different process that I need to use so that you can see all of these files, these pictures that exist behind the scenes. They originally weren't showing up to anyone. I got it updated and kind of reposted Friday morning. So everything should have been kind of working from Friday morning on out. I now know what I need to do to make sure those pictures show up every single time. So we shouldn't have to kind of run into that issue moving forward. But I apologize for that kind of, if anyone got on Thursday night and took that, there was kind of that issue with the pictures just not showing up, which didn't really give you any insight into being, if you couldn't see anything, it's like, well, what am I answering a question about, right? So that should be all fixed now. Everything kind of moving forward should be good to go, okay? Any other questions before we get going here? No? Okay, so we'll start with module 5 and 6, and talking about not taxes, but subsidies, right? So they're going to be kind of the exact opposite of what we talked about with taxes. So if I had a market and it was previously in equilibrium, right? Maybe it's at this price of 500 and a quantity of 15. So I think I showed windmills here. You drive around Indiana, you see all these windmills. Why, right? I mean, they're relatively expensive to produce, and so we would expect the equilibrium quantity would be relatively low. What does the government do to things that it thinks are good for the environment? It generally will hand out subsidies, right? So I'll make the point of my wife, the little X car she got was like a hybrid electric vehicle. She got a subsidy for buying, right? Because it's supposed to be better for the environment. So what happens, the way we'll model these subsidies, we're just going to look at models where we model them through supply, right? You can model them through demand. We'll have the same implications, just like when we talked about taxes. Didn't matter if it was on consumers or producers. But I'll kind of simplify a little bit and only expect you to know how we model this through subsidies to producers, okay? And those are pretty common. So if I give producers a subsidy, essentially their cost is whatever it was before, but now If it cost me 200 and the government's giving me $150, how much did it really cost me? 50, right? It cost me a lot less. So at every quantity, the cost to those suppliers is going to be whatever their cost would have been minus that subsidy. So even though we're adding that subsidy in, because they were cost, it was reducing producers' costs. So if producers are now being given the subsidy, they make decisions based off of their new kind of costs with the subsidy involved. So now where does that marginal benefit, now for all of these, the marginal benefit to consumers is still above that new kind of marginal cost to producers. And so now we won't stop at 15. We'll kind of continue to see producers and consumers be able to make an agreement up to the point where now that supply curve with the subsidy is equal to demand. So subsidies given to producers are essentially kind of like a supply what? Supply shifting to the right here is the supply increase, right? So here we kind of see the new equilibrium quantity is going to be higher. Now, it looks like the new price is going to be lower, but this is the price that consumers are going to pay. So with a subsidy, do consumers like this? Well, what happened to the price that they were paying from before to now? It was 500, now so they like that? Yeah, right? We're thinking about things like producer and consumer surplus. In general, we can kind of have the visuals. Why is this not? There we go. So why do they like that? Because consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the price that consumers pay and, sorry, I'm doing this backwards. The consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the marginal benefits of buying something and what was the cost to consumers. Well, that was the price they were paying. For producers, the price they were receiving or getting to keep, that was the benefit to them. So producer surplus, we said we can think of this term as surplus as kind of the net benefit. So here's the marginal benefit to producers. What's their marginal costs? Well, those were just represented by the supply curve, just like marginal benefits were represented by the demand curve. So consumer surplus, it really is the difference between marginal benefits and marginal cost to consumers, but marginal benefit is represented by demand. That's why it was the area visually between demand and the price consumers pay. Producer surplus, the difference between the price that the sellers get to sell the good for and their marginal cost, visually, area below the prices they get to keep or sell the good for, but above their supply curve. Okay? So lower prices to consumers, good thing, right? Now we might actually think, oh, well, the price is now lower. This is actually going to hurt producer surplus with these subsidies, but not quite, right? So if we look back here, we've got the new, why is this taking so long? There we go. The price the consumers pay is $400, right? When the consumer hands over $400 to this company, what's the total amount of money they make? Well, they're receiving $400 for that good, but they're also getting an additional amount, which is the subsidy from the government. So the price they actually get to keep will not be the price the consumer pays, but it'll be that amount plus the subsidy. What's the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the subsidy? That difference is just the subsidy. Right? So the price that sellers get to keep is now going to be higher, right? So you can kind of think about it as, well, where's producer surplus now? It's going to be this area below the price they get to keep or sell the good for, but above their supply curve. Now, I'm going to introduce deadweight loss with subsidies using this graph, and then I'll do something that's a little bit more complicated, but hopefully we'll kind of show you what's going on behind the scenes. So compared to without the subsidy, what has happened to the quantity after the subsidy? It's went up, right? Well, if subsidies, taxes, pricing, they disturb, right, us from the equilibrium point. The equilibrium point we were saying is where total surplus was maximized. It was the allocated efficient point where total surplus is maximized. So if our subsidy pushes us away from that point of 15, it should be lowering total surplus, or it should be causing some deadweight loss. What's the deadweight loss that's going to occur? Well, for every additional unit here from 15 to 25, what was true about the marginal cost to producers compared to the marginal benefits to consumers? Those marginal cost values were higher. So marginal costs are higher than the marginal benefit. What was the net benefit there? It was actually negative. So for every unit that this market produced past that allocated efficient quantity or the old equilibrium, we're losing this amount of total surplus on every single unit, which is why this triangle here would represent our deadweight loss. So in a lot of the other things we're doing with taxes, price ceilings, price floors, our deadweight loss triangle, like pointed to the right. Notice here, when we have overproduction, so all those other things I just mentioned, they led to lower levels, right? Lower quantities. There we had triangles pointing to the right. Now that we have something that causes overproduction, our deadweight loss triangle actually ends up pointing to the left. And the reason why is because when we had underproduction, we were missing out on surplus. From overproduction, we've actually just started at a point where total surplus was maximized, and we've just now produced things that had negative net benefits. Now the units that we're overproducing are actually just incurring us additional negative net benefits. Okay? So we've got a slightly different way of looking at this, and I've got some stuff in the slides here, but I'm going to try to draw this out, and it may end up being better on the slides, but we'll kind of see. And I don't know why this looks kind of weird to me. It looks like I'm gray and dead, but hopefully can you at least see what I'm doing up here? Okay. Okay. So let's say we have this market. I've got the supply curve. I've got my demand. Okay. Initially, where was total surplus? Right? Well, total surplus, before we have any government intervention, is just producer plus consumer surplus, right? So the old equilibrium price, you can kind of think about old consumer surplus was up here, and old producer surplus was down here. So our total surplus was just this triangle. Okay? Government hasn't gotten involved at all yet. Okay? What's going to happen if we have a subsidy in this market? So if we have a subsidy in this market, where is producer and consumer surplus now going to be? Well, the new quantity we see after this subsidy will now be higher. The price that consumers pay is going to be a little bit lower compared to that old equilibrium price. So where is consumer surplus now going to be? The area below the demand curve, but above the price they pay. So you can kind of think about this blue shaded area. It's going to be hard to kind of recreate in your notes here, but I've got some visuals I think that'll help in the slides with this. You can see like this much larger triangle was now going to be, we'll call this consumer surplus after the subsidy. Now, at the same time, this was the price consumers pay, but what did the sellers get to keep? That amount plus the subsidy. So the price that sellers were keeping was going to be up here. So now where is producer surplus? Well, it's going to be the area above their supply curve, above their marginal cost, but below the price that they now get to keep for selling that good. So you kind of see we're like double counting everything in this region, right? Producer surplus now is this much larger triangle. Okay? But part of these triangles, like in this region here, they're going to be like getting double counted, right? You kind of think about that represents producer, but it also represents consumer surplus, right? They overlap here. Okay? So how in the world do we end up with deadweight loss, right? We've had some gain to producer and consumer surplus. Remember, before that black shaded area was just this, right? Now the area in the middle here is getting double counted. It's like, well, we've gained total surplus then. Well, not quite, because all of the surplus gain that we had, how are we creating change in this market? The government was giving subsidies. So we now have a third person involved. Instead of tax revenue, with a subsidy, we're going to have government what? Not revenue, but expenditures, costs, right? What's that total cost going to be? Well, the difference between the price that the consumer pays and the seller keeps, this will now just be the value of the subsidy. If we take the amount of the subsidy and we multiply it by the quantity after we see the subsidy, that's going to represent our government expenditures, right? What would that look like visually? It's this entire rectangle. So you can kind of imagine that area that got double counted, well, it's actually only being counted once because everything in that region was also going to be matched with a government cost or a government expenditure. Those completely offset each other. So we had no gain in that region where my blue, red, and green shaded areas are all the same, right? They equally offset each other. What's the only area did we have additional costs to the government, but no additional gains to producers and consumers? It was going to be this little triangle here, which is what we saw in the original slide, right? We now have this overproduction. Our deadweight loss triangle is going to be relative to our old equilibrium quantity. For every additional unit that we're now seeing in the market, the difference between our supply curve and our demand curve. So it's going to be the additional negative surplus that exists from the overproduction of this good. Now, I understand I've got a lot of colors. Everything looks very muddy. I'll try to walk through it in the slides here, but hopefully you can kind of see like, yes, we are getting some gain in producer and consumer surplus. Some of this area is being counted twice, but it's counted twice, and then we subtract it out once because we now have to add in the government expenditures. It's not tax revenue anymore. It's not a good thing. This is an expense. Okay? So I don't know. To me, I think it's probably easier to think about it as how do you identify deadweight loss in these subsidy markets? Probably if you just think about the overproduction of this good, that difference between the marginal costs and the marginal benefits, marginal costs are now higher. So this is like the negative surplus that's existing because of this subsidy. So it's the amount of negative surplus that's taking away from what total surplus was before. So it's the entire thing, but part of government expense gets offset by additional surplus that was created because of the subsidy. However, there's a part of the governmental expense, right, that there's no additional subsidy to kind of compensate for it, and so that ends up being just our deadweight loss. Yep. Actually, let me see here. I don't want to do that. I want all these to be on the slides now. Okay, there we go. So we'll look at this one other way, and we'll kind of talk through this, right? So here is a market that's in equilibrium. Here's what my total surplus was before, okay? Now, initially, when I see this subsidy imposed, I might think, well, this is a great thing, right? Because now consumer surplus, and this is kind of what I drew on the slides, or sorry, drew on the dot cam, but I now have a much larger consumer surplus than I did before, right? Consumer surplus has went up. And producer surplus has also went up. There's now some area where kind of consumer and producer surplus, they're overlapping. So we're seeing that being double counted. So it looks like, okay, well, total surplus is higher than it was before. It's not just this little triangle. We have these much larger, these two larger triangles. The problem is all of this additional gain is offset by the fact that this entire rectangle represents government expenditure. So all that additional surplus we gain is offset by government expenditure. And what's the area that didn't have any additional surplus, but we now have this additional expenditure? Would be kind of this triangle over here, right? So yes, more surplus from the subsidies created for producers and consumers, but there's a huge negative surplus created for the government. So part of that gain to producers and consumers is offset by the fact that the government has to spend a lot of money to get that. And then part of the money the government had to spend, there was no additional surplus to kind of offset it, which is why we then have some kind of deadweight loss that exists here. Okay. So I don't know. I think seeing me kind of draw it out, I think it gets kind of convoluted. But I think seeing this big box here representing this is government expenditure, I can kind of see, oh yeah, all of this additional gain, this is all going to be offset. And I'm going to have this additional amount that was not offset by anything. This was the additional loss of surplus. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Yeah. Yep. So you could have a consumer subsidy. You would model it almost the exact. So it's like what we did with taxes last class. You can model it through the supply or demand curve, and you end up with the same results. You would end up, if it was the same amount of a tax, right? You'd end up with the same deadweight loss. Yep. Yep. I'm not going to push you guys to do subsidies through demand. We'll kind of just focus on one to kind of make it a little bit easier. And in general, I only kind of give you examples where I'm thinking about the tax being on producers as well. Any other questions for you? So I think also this will help a little bit as we talk about the next module, which is module 7. I can kind of relate it to these subsidies from some things we're going to talk about. So I have to set up initially what we're going to be talking about today. We're no longer thinking about government intervention, disrupting markets. We're thinking about now, up to this point, we've only talked about private markets. So the only people that were either gaining some surplus, whether that was producers or consumers, were producers or consumers of that good. However, we know that those are not the only people that are going to be impacted by a market existing. So for instance, we might have what we call positive externalities. So this word of externality just means it's an additional cost or benefit to someone other than the producers or consumers in this market. So, if you think about, you live next to, my neighbors have what are bee boxes called? Whatever they are, right? They're the boxes where they put bees and they create honey and then they go sell the honey, right? So they're producers of honey. There's people that purchase honey. Even if I don't buy honey at all, I'm not a consumer. I'm not involved in that market. My neighbor having the production of this honey, what do you think it does to the flowers and things around my yard? Do we know anything about bees? They pollinate, right? So my yard looks a lot better because there's all these bees that are nearby. Right? So the fact that someone else is producing this good, I receive a positive externality. The other ones you can think about, like bakery smells. I don't know. Maybe if it's maybe you get an apartment and you're near Starbucks. Even if you don't, buy coffee from that Starbucks, you wake up to the smell of coffee. You like that, right? You may not be a consumer of that type of coffee at all, but you get this nice kind of positive externality that exists from the production of that good. Okay? These probably aren't as common, although we can kind of talk through some more examples as we work through stuff here today. Yep. So there's also negative externalities, right? So there's additional benefits when things happen. What's a huge negative production externality that is like the easiest one? Pollution, right? Anything that causes, so, I didn't put it up here because I don't like to, I put pollution up here. I don't like to pick on the farmers, but these farmers aren't like farming one field these days. It's like massive. They're basically large companies, right? And so anytime you see the production of wheat, corn, all these different products, there's a lot of runoff that comes from these fields. The drinking water has all of that runoff in it. I would never suggest any river in Indiana you dip a cup into and drink, because it probably has all kinds of pesticides and terrible things in it, right? There's a lot of negative production externalities from all of this factory and all this farming, right? So pollution is probably the easiest way to think about a negative production externality. We also have consumption externalities. So it doesn't necessarily, when we work through these models, it won't matter where the externality comes from. We'll still model it the same way as if it's a negative or positive. So it doesn't matter if it's a positive production or a positive consumption externality, we'll end up modeling it the same way. But just to kind of round out the discussion, what are some positive consumption externalities? Well, all of you consuming college education, getting a degree, that doesn't just benefit you, that benefits every other member in society, right? Makes it more likely you go start your own company, come up with some great device that all of us then have in our households, right? That's the general idea. You consuming public education or even private education, right? You're becoming a much more productive member of society. Everyone in society is going to benefit from that. Another really easy one that's somewhat in the not too distant future, not too distant past. Anytime you get immunized, you guys all get immunized, and I'm standing here in front of you, guess what? I don't have to, and I enjoy the positive consumption externality from you getting immunized, all right? The problem is we all think that, and nobody gets immunized, then we all get sick, right? But that would be the general idea of a positive consumption externality. Right? I don't have to be involved in that market at all. As long as you are, I'm protected. Then we could have some examples of negative consumption externalities. So this is going to be something like, if you're at one of these bars that are not that any of you should be at these bars, but if you're at a bar where they're grandfathered in, that they can still smoke. In Indiana, there's a lot of bars where people can still smoke inside because they're so old. They were grandfathered in. If you walk in there, even if you're not a producer, you're not a consumer of cigarettes, when you walk into that bar, you're hit with a wave of smoke, you start hacking, you just had a negative consumption externality from someone else. They're consuming the product, you have to deal with the negative externality. I'll put one in the comments with you guys. What if you had a roommate who, they consume hours of video game playing at night, keeping you up till 2 or 3 in the morning? You don't play video games at all, you have a huge negative externality because you can't sleep. I can't tell you how many times I've heard roommate horror stories, right? So you're not involved in that market at all, but the other person's consumption of that good has a negative consumption externality onto you, okay? All right, any questions over this general idea, kind of introduce the idea of externalities? So I think negative externalities are a little bit easier to think about, so we'll start out with those. So let's say before, we didn't really get as specific here. When we were talking about supply and demand, we really were talking about, we would say, the private marginal costs and the private marginal benefits. It was only the marginal benefits and marginal costs to the people in that market, the consumers and producers of that good. There's going to exist some additional costs or benefits to other people in society. So we're now going to make that distinction, okay? So before we kind of go too far, if you think about there being negative externalities of something, there's some additional costs. If I'm thinking about where would society's marginal cost curve be, what do we think it would be relative to where the private marginal costs are? So if I've got some good, I've got my demand curve, private marginal benefits, supply curve, private marginal costs. If there's additional costs to either the production or consumption of this good, the cost to society, or whatever the cost to the producers were before, plus some additional amount. Whatever the costs were before, plus some additional amount. So, should probably use colors here. Our marginal social cost curve is going to be a little bit higher, right? Because it reflects that it's not just the cost of the producers now in this market, there's some additional or external costs to other people who aren't even in the market. So our marginal social cost is going to be a little bit higher. Or what does that kind of look like? So if I was looking at supply, marginal social cost looks like it's a decrease in supply. It's not. Supply isn't changing, but our society's supply curve or our marginal social costs could think about that as decreasing, right? It's going to be a little bit higher. Now, just intuitively, before we work through this, if there's additional costs that say people aren't factoring in, do you think they do too much or too little of something? Too much, right? So if you're not factoring in and there's some additional costs, you might end up doing something where the marginal benefits isn't greater than the total cost because you're only making decisions based off of your own costs. There might be costs to society that are huge, right? So where do we see what people do this all the time? The optimal amount to litter, right? Should be for society always 0. People throw things out of their car window all the time, right? Why? Because it's convenient. The marginal cost to them is relatively low. But by them throwing that trash out the window, they just cause these huge kind of costs to society, right? They weren't factoring that into their decision making. We get too many people littering. Someone had a hand. Okay. What does that look like in our model? Well, where would society's optimal quantity be here? So the market, where would supply be equal to demand? Here was our kind of old equilibrium quantity. That's because we said the market will arrive at the unit where the marginal cost to the producers of that last unit is exactly the same as the marginal benefit. Well, society would make optimal decisions the exact same way. Where does the marginal cost of society equal the marginal benefit to society? What unit does that exist at? Well, here, our private marginal benefits, since we don't have any positive externalities, that's going to be the same as society's marginal benefits, right? Here, we're just looking at a negative externality. So where would society's marginal benefits be greater than society's marginal cost for every unit up to here, right? Past this quantity, the marginal cost of society is now greater than the marginal benefit for society, they wouldn't choose to see those units produced and consumed on the market. So where's society's optimal quantity? It's going to be lower. Right? Questions on this idea? So with negative externalities, marginal social costs are higher, and so the market will always arrive at a quantity that's greater than that socially optimal quantity, right? Because the private consumers and producers in this market don't factor in these external costs, okay? Any other questions before I keep moving here? Okay. So I'm going to jump the gun a little bit, but I've got some slides, so we'll kind of just revisit it later. If I have relative to where society's optimal point should be, what did the market do? Over or underproduce relative to where society wanted it? Overproduce. So if we overproduce something, that means we're going to have some units that have, what did we say with subsidies? When we overproduce, the deadweight loss comes from the fact that we're now producing units that had negative net benefits or negative surplus. Where's the negative surplus to society here? Well, if we produce past this point, every quantity here, society's marginal benefits are lower than their marginal costs. So all of this represents negative surplus to society, or negative surplus, we're eating in the total surplus, that's just deadweight loss. So when we have negative externalities, it kind of starts to look like, at least it's similar to subsidies in the sense that we have overproduction. The market overproduces relative to where society wants it to be. Anytime we have overproduction, our deadweight loss triangle points to the left. It's not the most technical way of remembering it, but that is a kind of nice, easy kind of way to think about it. Okay. Any questions before we jump back into the slides here? Okay. So, excuse me. So here, we had our old equilibrium, right? What happened if we had an external cost? Well, our marginal social cost curve, we said, would be higher. At every quantity, total cost to society now, whatever the costs were before to producers, plus this additional amount. Now here, I just kept it as a nice, easy $1 negative externality or external cost. So at every quantity, notice at a quantity of 25, the difference between our private marginal costs and our social marginal cost, that difference 3 to 4 was just the value of the external cost. And I could look at any quantity and prove this, right? At a quantity of 10, what was the difference between my private marginal costs and society's marginal cost of that 10th unit? The difference here, 150 to 250, that same external cost of $1. So just like you could look at the difference between a supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax to determine the value of the tax, we can determine the value of the external cost by the difference between our private marginal costs and society's marginal costs. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? It shouldn't be too wild there. Okay. So I'm trying to keep an eye on time. My phone wasn't. So I kind of already talked about this, but where would the socially efficient quantity be? Well, where does society's marginal cost equal society's marginal benefits? It's going to be at a quantity that's much lower, right? You can kind of notice here for any quantity here, the marginal benefit to society greater than the marginal cost. So they definitely want to see this produced and consumed up until we get to this point where they're exactly equal. Past that point, we said the marginal benefits to society lower than the marginal costs. So there to society, surplus for those units would just be negative. So if we allow the market to get to that quantity of 25, what is our deadweight loss? Well, it's going to be the loss of surplus, the difference between the marginal costs and the marginal benefits for all of those additional units that we overproduced. So that was the same thing I had kind of drawn up here in the dot cam, just kind of slightly different visual. Okay. So how do I calculate deadweight loss here? It's still a triangle. So it's just going to be like we were calculating deadweight loss before, 1/2 times base times the height. And we'll work through some problems here later where we actually have some more grid lines and some actual values to this. Okay. So what do I want to say here? Oh, so how can we maybe solve this? I jumped the gun, but if I have the overproduction of something, how can I maybe discourage the use of that? So what's one pricing tool the government has that can decrease the quantity in the market? Taxes, all right? Now, we'll talk later on. I'll kind of show you some visuals. If we can use some of the other price controls, but taxes are going to be a way that more often than not, given data, we can estimate what some of these external costs are, and we can try to impose what we call a Pigovian tax, which is a tax that's exactly equal to that external cost. If I could tax supply exactly equal to the cost of society, additional cost of society, what happens? Taxes will decrease supply, and I would decrease supply until it matches my social cost curve. Then the market starts to make decisions basically based off of society's marginal cost curve. We'll dive deeper into this later. I just want to kind of mention at this point, right? Kind of starting to look similar to some things we've already talked about. Okay? So what happens to surplus? We're thinking about society surplus versus kind of the market. So if I'm thinking about society surplus, that's just going to be the difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs up to whatever quantity we're looking at. Now, if we get to that socially efficient quantity, which looks like it's here right about 40, right? Then the total social surplus, that difference between the marginal social benefits, marginal social cost, is represented by this black triangle, right? So if society could choose the point where total surplus is maximized, that's where it would choose, right? And that total surplus value would be the highest that we could possibly see. Now, this gets a little bit tricky. I don't think it's as tricky as subsidies. But if we allow this market to operate freely and don't get involved at all, they won't factor in those external costs. So where would the market get to here? Well, the private marginal benefits are greater than the private marginal costs all the way up to this quantity of 55. What would producer surplus be? Excuse me. The difference between the marginal benefits to consumers and the price that they pay. So here would be our consumer surplus. What would producer surplus be? That's just the difference between the benefit to them, which is the price, and their marginal cost represented by the supply curve. So we have producer surplus being up here. So this is kind of what we did last week, right? Without any government intervention, the market's just operating freely at will. We're going to end up with kind of consumer surplus being the area above price, below the demand curve, producer surplus area below the price, but above their marginal cost or above the supply curve. If we have some external costs, excuse me, why will the market getting out to this point not actually lead to a higher total surplus? Because it looks like, well, that total surplus area is less than that, right? The problem is, before we could calculate total surplus by simply adding producer to consumer surplus. Now we have a third component. If this market has a negative externality, what's an additional kind of type of surplus that's existing? The cost to society, cost to everybody else that's not involved in this market. What's going to be the total cost to everybody who's not involved in this market? Well, if the market stops at, say, 55 units, and every single unit there was an additional cost of $10 to society, what would the total cost be? Just 55 times that $10. Well, visually, where would that be on this graph? Well, for every single unit that's sold, I can think about the difference between my marginal social cost curve and the private marginal costs. That difference just was the value of that negative externality. So, parallelogram, just like a rectangle, right? We can find, kind of just think about here, what would the height of this parallelogram be? Goes from 10 to what, 35, right? So what would the value of my external cost be here? I could do that at multiple points, but if I do it here, if I'm going from 10 to 35, the difference between my marginal social cost and my private marginal cost, that's just the value of my external cost. So the external cost must be, 25. How many units was the market producing and consuming? 55. So kind of the additional cost, right, to society from this market getting to that free open market equilibrium point was the value of the external cost, 25, times that quantity that the market stopped at, 55. that would represent this kind of red shaded area. So notice everything in this range, yes, there was producer and consumer positive surplus coming from those units, but there was also additional costs to society that negated it, right? Or that canceled it out, if you want to think about it that way. So every area, or sorry, the entire area here, this just represents basically a wash, right? The additional benefits were outweighed by the additional costs. So there was no change in total surplus there. What did cause a change in our total surplus? Well, for every unit kind of past that socially efficient quantity of 40, we now also have this additional cost to society that isn't being canceled out by any additional gain to producers or consumers. So now this area here would represent our deadweight loss. Because total surplus before, we weren't factoring in kind of society's costs, would have been, if we got to that socially efficient quantity, it would have just been this area right here. Now, we still have this total surplus, but because we saw the overproduction of this good, for every unit from that socially efficient quantity 40 to the market arriving at that quantity 55, those additional 15 units, the costs incurred to society that wasn't canceled out by any gain to producers or consumers would be this area here. So this represents surplus that is negative. Why is it negative? Because the cost to society are greater than the benefits to society for these units. So anytime you have the overproduction of a good, you're essentially just decreasing total surplus because every additional unit, you're just incurring more and more negative surplus there. So kind of negative externalities kind of look similar in a way to subsidies, which is kind of weird because the way that we can fix these, we said, was in taxes, right? And the reason why is because with negative externalities, the market will overproduce from the socially efficient point. So how can we push it back to the socially efficient point? Tax it. But once again, kind of with subsidies, anytime you have the overproduction, so the market was overproducing relative to the quantity that society wanted. So what did we have? We had a deadweight loss triangle pointing to the left. Okay. Yeah, in time here. All right. Any questions on this idea before we keep going? It probably won't take time to do it, but if you really wanted to prove this to yourself, you could calculate this triangle, calculate this triangle, calculate the area of this parallelogram, add them all up, whatever value you get, compare that to the area of this total surplus, and that difference should just be that deadweight loss, right? It was the amount of surplus that was going to be lost from the overproduction of that good. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving? Yeah. So here what we're doing, the thought experiment, is we're assuming what is going to be the deadweight loss that exists from allowing the market to just make the decision. The market does not factor in society's cost, this additional cost to society. So if society could choose, right, they would choose that lower quantity. But we're saying because society doesn't choose, like you and I, we don't determine, I don't know, the overall production of lithium batteries and how much pollution that's creating, right? So there's still going to be some cost to us, but the producers and consumers in that market, they're not factoring in how it's going to impact us. They're only factoring in their private marginal benefits and their private marginal costs. So the market will arrive at a quantity that's higher than what society would like. In practice, society doesn't get to choose what the quantity is, unless we're in like a dictatorship or something like that. Any other questions before we keep moving? All right, so positive externalities, everything's going to basically kind of work, not the exact opposite, but a lot of things will be the opposite, right? So if I have positive externalities, the way that we're going to model these, we can think about, we've got some external or some additional benefit to somebody else other than the producers and consumers in that market. So if I'm thinking about additional benefits, if I model additional costs through kind of like my supply curve, additional benefits are going to look like modeled through my demand curve. What represents marginal benefits? Demand. So now, excuse me, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. We have the private marginal benefits or demand, right? At every single quantity, no, I didn't want all these lines, but we're going to have some additional benefit to society. So for marginal social benefit, when we have positive externalities, our society's marginal benefit curve will actually be higher than the private marginal benefit curve, because it's going to be whatever the private marginal benefits were plus some external benefit. So now we've got our society's marginal benefit curve being actually above that private marginal benefit curve. Now, I think I alluded to it here, right? But if we're thinking about, if there's positive externalities that exist to something, and the people in that market aren't taking them into consideration, they're going to choose a quantity that is to. So if I'm, in fact, making an optimal decision, but I left out a bunch of additional benefits, I'm going to choose an optimal number that's way too, not too high, right? If I think that the benefit of going to college to me is nothing. Am I going to go to college? I mean, there's going to be some cost in that. But if there's a huge benefit to society for me to go to college, what would society like me to do? Go to college. So what did you do? You chose a number that was too low relative to what society wanted. So we can see that play out kind of with the visual as well, right? So here, if we allow the market to decide, it'll choose an equilibrium where the marginal benefit of the last unit is equal to the marginal cost, with the private marginal benefits are equal to the private marginal costs at this quantity of 30. Right? However, society says, well, look, we would actually, our, society's marginal benefits are equal to society's marginal cost at a quantity of 40. We would like these additional 10 units to be produced and consumed in the market. Right? Because why? For each one of these units, the additional benefits to society are greater than the additional costs. So if we stop production at 30 here, we stop this market at 30, we're missing out on all of this now positive surplus, right? Because now the marginal benefits for these units are greater than the marginal cost of society. So if we allow the market to kind of choose, right? Oh, what I want, I'm going to skip ahead here. There we go. If we allow the market to choose, the deadweight loss that's going to be created is the difference between the marginal social benefits, and we don't have any negative externalities anymore, so our private marginal costs are the same as society's marginal costs. So the surplus that we're missing out on by the market choosing this lower quantity would be visually this kind of entire area here. Okay. Now I'll revisit this and draw kind of this out here in a second. But what I skipped on this slide was, hopefully this isn't too bad now. If I'm looking at something like this, how can I determine what the external benefit was? We said we could determine the external cost. It was just the difference between private marginal costs and society's marginal costs. So how can I find the external benefit? It's just going to be at the same quantity. What's the difference between the private marginal benefits? So it looks like that would be 50, and society's marginal benefits at that quantity, 70. So the external benefit would just be $20. Now I can do this at any quantity. So notice if I did it down here, for that 40th unit, what was the private marginal benefits? 40. What was society's marginal benefits? 60. So that external benefit in these models, we're assuming it's the same for every single unit. For every single unit that's consumed and produced in this market, society is benefiting by, in this example, $20 additional. Okay? Complicate this and make the lines different slopes, but we won't go through that. Okay. Excuse me. So if I was calculating this, what would my deadweight loss be here? Well, the market stops at this quantity. Society would like the quantity to be a little bit higher. So for all these units from 30 to 40, what's the surplus we were missing out on? The difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal cost will be this little triangle here. So what's the height? 20. What's the base? 10. 20 times 10. So what? 200. What didn't I do? This is the area of a triangle. So 20 times 10 times 1/2. All right. Don't forget that 1/2 when we're looking at the areas of triangles. Right? Let me think what I have here. How far do I want to push this today? Okay. There we go. So I'll show you this. I think we'll have time. We've got another way of thinking about how we calculate deadweight loss in a second. So let's say we had this external benefit factored in, and somehow we have like all agreed that like we're going to make collective decisions as a society, right? With this nice, I don't know, non-cult group of people who make decisions together, which always happens, right? So let's say we are choosing where the optimal point for society would be. Well, where would the marginal social benefit be equal to the marginal social cost? Way out here, right? So total surplus to society, the difference between the marginal social benefits and marginal social cost of society would be this entire triangle. If we allow the market to make the decision, they're going to choose a much lower quantity, right? At this quantity, what's producer and consumer surplus? Hopefully this is kind of getting old hat here, but consumer surplus, the area below consumers' marginal benefits, but above their marginal cost, which is the price they're paying. What's producer surplus? The area below their marginal benefit, which is the price that they're receiving, but above their marginal costs, which are represented by the supply curve. So here would be the total surplus that exists in the market if we allow the market to choose that equilibrium quantity. Now, why then is that entire kind of white area not deadweight loss? Well, when the market stops at this quantity of 55, for all those 55 units, what's also happening? We have a positive externality. When those units are produced and consumed in the market, society is benefiting, right? The consumers and producers have chosen 55 for every single unit they produce and consume. There's going to be some external benefit to society. What would that look like? Well, what's the difference between my demand curve and my marginal social benefit curve? That represents the external benefit for every unit. If I took that and multiplied it by the number of units the market stops at 55, that should represent the additional benefit to society. What does that look like visually? Well, it's not a rectangle, but it's a parallelogram, right? Where kind of height, I guess, or length, width, however you want to call it, of that parallelogram is just the value of the external benefit. What's its kind of base there? Well, it's going from 0 to whatever quantity the market stops at. So that would be the quantity the market stops at times the external benefit associated with every single unit. That would be the total external benefit to society from where the market chooses. Okay? So this whole area, consumer plus producer plus now like society surplus, that would represent our total surplus. So now we can kind of see this area relative to when we were at the socially efficient quantity. The only difference there is going to be this little white triangle here, right? So why did that represent deadweight loss? Once again, we said probably another way, a better way to think about this is the market was underproducing from the socially efficient quantity. So for every unit in this range, what were we missing out on as society? The difference between our social benefits and our social costs, right? So that's why that triangle would represent deadweight loss here. Once again, a consistent theme, the market did what relative to the socially efficient quantity? Under or overproduced? Underproduced. So just like when we had taxes that led to underproduction, what happens to our deadweight triangle? It points to the right. It's not technical, but it always ends up being true. So it's one way to kind of remember. Underproduction, that deadweight loss triangle will always point to your right. Or overproduction, it would always point to the left. Okay? And that extends across modules 5, 6, and 7. Right? It extends between externalities, but also price controls, taxes, subsidies. Okay? Excuse me. All right. So that's our deadweight loss, right? How much time do I want to spend here? I think we got enough time. So just to kind of make this point of what deadweight loss is, when we have positive externalities, we don't have we said deadweight loss is represented by here's the quantity that the market, excuse me, sorry, we'll get to. Here's the point that would be allocated efficient, or would be society's kind of equilibrium point. So the market underproduced. So for every unit in this range, what surplus did society miss out on? Well, you can kind of think about it as society's surplus. Whenever we're calculating surplus, it's just the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. It's just now we're talking about society's surplus, the difference between society's marginal benefits and marginal costs. So for every unit in this range, what surplus were we missing out on? Well, we didn't have any negative externalities, so our private marginal costs were synonymous with our social costs. So for every unit, it would have just been the difference between society's marginal benefits, society's marginal costs. Here was our deadweight loss. Okay. One thing that actually kind of makes it easy, not easy, it's interesting that it comes out of these models. I just wanted to point it out if it wasn't clear to people yet. What will the height of this deadweight loss triangle always be? Not a specific number, but a concept. So the difference between my private marginal benefits and my social benefits, that will just be my external benefits or that positive externality. All right. So here, the height of my deadweight loss triangle will always be whatever the value of that external benefit was. Right. Just the difference between my private and social benefits. What does the base of that triangle always be? End up being, sorry. Well, it's how much the market was underproducing, right? It was how many more units society wanted, right? Or how many units the market was underproducing by. So that'll always be the case. The deadweight loss that exists when we have these positive externalities will always be the height of that triangle, the external benefit. The base will always be how many units we were underproducing. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? I wanted to point out one more thing before we kind of go. So I'm doing this here. Man, let's say, and just to be, you're taking notes and you're labeling them. This was positive externalities, right? So let's say instead, I want to think about negative externalities, right? So the market arrives at this quantity, right? If we have a negative externality, we said, where's marginal social cost going to be? Above what? Supply or the private marginal cost, because at every quantity, the marginal costs to society are a little bit higher. So here is my marginal social costs. Now the market actually overproduces. But notice we said, where's our deadweight loss now? Well, it's going to be for every unit that we overproduced. What was society's surplus? Well, the difference between society's marginal benefit, there's now no longer positive externalities. The difference between that and their marginal costs would be represented by this triangle, which would all represent the marginal costs are greater than marginal benefits. So that would be negative surplus, right? Or deadweight loss. Right? What is the height of this triangle always represented? The difference between my supply curve and marginal social cost, that's just what? Yeah, my external cost or the negative externality value. What's the base of this triangle always going to be? The number of units that the market overproduced by. Right? So you kind of hopefully see the parallels between these two models, right? Deadweight loss with positive externalities, just the external benefit times the quantity that we're underproducing by, and of course it's a triangle, so times a half. Negative externalities, the value of the external cost times the number of units we're overproducing by, multiplied by half, so we're still looking at the area of a triangle. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Okay. All right, so I can kind of round that out if we have time. Well, I know we'll have time, so I'm gonna just go here now. We'll keep going. So we already kind of talked about this, so I'll kind of go through it a little bit quick. But we said, if we have a negative externality, what's one way we could fix that? Well, we said we want to push that supply curve back to match up with society's marginal cost. So how can we do that? Just tax the good. What would a perfect tax be, or what we would call as a Pigovian tax? It would be if we had a tax value that was exactly equal to the external cost, right? Or exactly equal to that negative externality that existed. That way we know we're getting the supply curve plus the tax to match up with society's marginal cost. Now individuals in that market start making decisions not based off of their own private marginal costs, but their private marginal costs plus the tax, which if we've set the tax correctly, should match up perfectly with society's costs. So that's why, the ideal corrective tax is the value of the external cost. If we have positive externalities, what's one that we said we're going to get underproduction? So what's one way I can encourage the quantity to increase in the market? Subsidies. So what would a perfect subsidy be if we set a subsidy exactly equal to the external benefit? I think that's all I have here, but I do want to kind of make a point here. So, we think about things that have a lot of externalities. The government will, negative externalities, the government will use taxes. So just to give some examples, so I'm not just talking out of my, just talking. So I sometimes cover myself, sometimes I don't. So if you think about things like states that have legalized marijuana or tobacco or alcohol, all three of those products have additional taxes on them, right? So why do you think the government wants to tax us? Well, they can make a pretty good amount of tax revenue because they're pretty inelastic. We've talked about that. But in taxing them, what should I also be able to do? Reduce the quantity, right? If I think that there's negative externalities that exist from having my population be too drunk and stoned, maybe I tax those goods a little bit more, right? I try to kind of push us back to that socially optimal quantity. What's a way that they use subsidies to incentivize it? All of you in this room, not all, a large percent of you in this room right now probably have some form of government subsidy in terms of tuition, right? Even if it's a small amount, subsidize loans. Sometimes even if you have Pell Grant and whatever the name of it. But there's a lot of that that kind of even small amounts, but there's subsidies given to people who want to go to college to incentivize more people to go to college, right? Just like in my example being in class, I was using for subsidies my wife's car. What do we want as a society? More clean and renewable energy. So what do we give to people who buy new cars that are electric? Subsidies. You might have seen flyers and stuff for this. What are they trying to get homeowners, so maybe you haven't seen as much. What are they trying to get everybody to put on their roofs? Solar panels. Jesus Christ, they get a million emails and think about it, right? Well, they think that that's better for society, so what are they doing? They're subsidizing that, right? So we see this happen all the time. Anytime we think there's a positive externality that exists, we try to subsidize that good because we want to get to that socially efficient, kind of allocated efficient point. The market being at its allocated efficient point, that's good for the people in that market. But as a society, we should want to maximize the total surplus of our entire society. So we subsidize things, we have positive externalities. Anytime we have kind of these, anytime we have negative externalities, we're going to want to try to tax those goods. Anytime we have positive externalities, we're going to want to try to subsidize those goods. Okay? So let me see here. I have this slide in here. We can have command and control economies. I guess I mentioned dictatorships earlier. Yeah, like the government's just can come in and impose exactly how many units can be produced and sold. That's great. But a lot more of the time, what we see, a lot more of the a more common kind of type of government we see for most countries is going to be some form of a market-based policy, right? And so how can we get the market to arrive at these correct socially efficient quantities? Well, we can try to use things like taxes and subsidies. We'll talk about an example. I think next class I've got something about tradable pollution permits. It's kind of interesting. But in general, what we want to try to do, instead of just kind of trying to come in and mandate You go to college, you go to college, you produce 20 units, right? Instead of just command and control, like telling people what to do, we want to try to get people to internalize these additional costs and benefits. How can we do that? Quite often through use of taxes and subsidies. Right? We'll talk about some other ways we can use maybe things we talked about before, price controls, price ceilings, if we have a little bit of time at the end of class. Otherwise, I'll kind of pick up with that on Thursday. But I want to make sure we have plenty of time. And we should be able to go through these pretty quickly. But I got a couple questions just to kind of see. I've talked a lot today. Let's, what does this look like in practice? What are the types of questions I'll ask you when we're thinking about positive and negative externalities? So just a handful or a couple. And I think these are just going to be about negative externalities today. I'll bring in some more next class. So let's say here. All right. So let's say I've got this market and I want to know what's the value of the external cost. Now, first of all, I didn't label anything here. What should that green curve represent? Demand, it's downward sloping, right? Not only is it demand, we've now kind of made the differentiation. It represents private marginal benefits. But now if there's no positive externalities, my private marginal benefits are actually the same as society's marginal benefits. Okay, so those two things are matching up here because I don't have any positive externalities. Which of these lines is going to be my supply curve? The blue or the black line? So here I told you there's negative externalities. So a negative externality will mean that society's costs are what relative to the producer's costs? Negative externality, there's an additional cost. So society's cost will be higher or lower? Higher, right? So which of these curves is higher? The black curve, right? It's representing that at every single quantity, the cost to society is a little bit higher than the cost that exists to the producers in this market. So I know my blue curve will be supply, my black curve will be the marginal social cost. What's the value of that external cost? Well, it's just the difference between those two lines. I could use any quantities. I'm going to use the dashed ones here just to make it a little bit easier for me. So it looks like at this quantity of 50, the private marginal cost, or where I was at in the supply curve, 45. What's society's cost at that quantity? 50. So my external cost would just be, so if my private marginal costs are 35, society's marginal costs are 50, the external cost is 15, right? Shouldn't be too tough. You guys are scaring me a little bit. So the difference between my private marginal benefits and marginal social costs, that's just the value of the external cost of the negative externality. Just like the difference between the private marginal benefits and the marginal social benefits, that difference would be my external benefit, right? Or the positive externalities value. Okay? Any questions on that one? Shouldn't be too bad here. We then think about, so I've got this negative externality that exists. What's the socially optimal price and quantity? So I didn't really spend a lot of time on this thinking about our prices and quantities here. But I've got kind of different ones here. So if I allow the market to decide, where does the market stop at? A quantity of 60, price of 40. If we get to that socially efficient point, what would the quantity be? 50. And the price that would result in 50 units that society would like would be what? Also 50. So we'll talk a little bit more about next class. We really were focusing on quantities today over under production, but we can get certain quantities in the market by changing what that equilibrium price is. What are some ways we can change the equilibrium price? Taxes, subsidies. What are some other things we talked about? Price floors and price ceilings, right? Are also ways that we can kind of get to this, what society wants to be the equilibrium price, okay? So there it should be what? 50 and 50, all right? We kind of said that's where society wants it to be, okay? And I might draw this out here in a second just to kind of prove this to us. So here's going to be one. If I have this negative externality, where is my dead weight loss going to be? Okay? So the market is going to stop at what quantity? Where would supply equal demand? Or where would the private marginal benefits be equal to the private marginal costs? 60. We said society would want this quantity to be at. So the overproduction of this good is going to cause there to be negative surplus from some of these units. All these additional units from 50 to 60 will have negative surplus that exists. If we have overproduction, which way should that deadweight loss triangle point? To the left, right? So here, I'm going to guess it's this triangle, but why is it this triangle? Well, because what does this represent? It represents that for all of these additional 10 units, the difference between society's marginal costs and society's marginal benefits, that would be representing social surplus. However, if the costs are greater than the benefits, that's representing negative social surplus or deadweight loss. Okay? So we would do what? The height of that triangle should be equal to what? The value of the negative externality or the external cost. Sure enough, goes from 40 to 60. It was that same. Well, I must have changed it wasn't the same as what we had. Wait, am I looking at this wrong? It's not 60. It's 40 to 55. So yeah, it is. It matches up exactly with what that external cost we had before was, which was 15. What should the base of that deadweight loss triangle be? We said before, it's going to be the number of units that we saw overproduced. Sure enough, the base of this triangle is going from what society wanted 50, where the market stopped at 60. So 10 times 15, 150. What else do I need to do? Multiply by half, giving me that 75. Okay. So I'll leave this up here, but I do want to make kind of one more point, since we mentioned this idea that society can kind of have the price they want as well. Right? So if I had a market and it was, right, did have some negative externality that existed, we talked about, well, I could impose a tax and shift that supply curve up so that I could get my socially efficient quantity to be the same as the quantity after the tax, right? If I could just set that tax in such a way that the supply curve plus the tax was exactly equal to my marginal social cost, I can drive this market, which was out at this higher quantity, overproducing, back to my socially efficient quantity. Okay? Well, instead of a tax, what's another way I could do? Or what's another way I could do this? Let's say I imposed a price floor. And I impose that price floor at exactly the same value as the price that society would want. Right? So if I set that price floor at the price that society would want, right? So kind of thinking about the quantity and price society wants, well, what ends up happening? Every consumer in this market, if they're going to have to pay this higher price, they no longer want to buy any of these units because the marginal cost to consumers is now greater than their marginal benefits. So consumers stop here. So what did that price floor do? It changed the equilibrium to be the exact same as where society would want that quantity to be. And how would I do that? I would impose that price floor at exactly equal to that price society would want to get to that allocated efficient point for society. Okay? So I can use taxes, but I can get the exact same result as if I used a price floor. Okay? Now, we would say we probably like taxes a little more because it makes people internalize it. Price floor just kind of says like, you can't pay a price below this. We talk about, easier to change taxes than price floors if things are kind of constantly changing. But I just want to introduce this idea. We'll talk through more price controls on Thursday, kind of finish up this discussion of externalities. The subsidy stuff, you won't be quizzed on this week. That was what we kind of didn't get covered last week. So it's really just going to be externalities that you're going to be quizzed on this week. Okay? All right. See you guys on Thursday. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to stop this. So